Okay, welcome to week 2 of our podcast of Blink. I had the summary. The main topics in our reading were the Warren Harding error and Paul Van Ripper's big theory. The Warren Harding error was about looking at people and just making assumptions. For example, Warren Harding, people thought he'd be a great president just because he looked very authoritative, but he was actually a very awful president. And the big victory is all about, it's hard to just instantly be spontaneous, and so sometimes you need to set rules for being spontaneous. And so that was what we read this week.
Okay, so for the challenge 2, the whole focus is on Malcolm Gladwell's history, and so I learned about his ancestry and heritage, and he is half black. His mother is Jamaican and his father is white and English. On his mother's side, one of his European ancestors came to Jamaica during the mid-17th century and started a line of wealthy Jamaican and European mixed ancestors named the Fords. On his father's side, his great-great-grandparents, Thomas Adams and Jane Wilson, left England and Ireland to join the gold rush in Victoria, Australia in the 1850s. I found this from a website on pbs.org.
Okay, so I was looking at historical and social events that happened prior to Malcolm Gladwell's birth, and the main thing that was going on was the civil rights movement. So I looked at, it was the historical channel's website, I don't know, and it had a timeline of events that happened. So a couple of the main ones that I found was in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. And then in September of 1957, they had 9 black high schoolers. They were integrating into the Little Rock High School, and they weren't let in, and so troops had to come in and escort them in. 1961, there would just be freedom riders that would go around the U.S. and ride and protest segregation. And then just a couple of months in August of 1963, a couple months before Gladwell was born, they did the March on Washington. 250,000 people marched to Washington. That's where the I Have a Dream speech and other people talked. And then even a couple of days after Malcolm Gladwell was born, just I think it's 3 days or something, the bomb exploded at Birmingham, killing these 4 girls in the church. So that's just what was going on during that time.
Yeah, going off what Chelsea said, I found a transcription of a speech from Martin Luther King Jr. It was April 9th, 1967 in the New Covenant Baptist Church in Chicago. It was a religious sermon, and he was speaking on just how people are always so focused on living a long life and just getting through life. But I think if we just take this into the context of the book and think, instead of thinking in long and taking a long time to think, we can branch out and think in different ways, think in short bursts. And I think that really influenced how he thought, because Martin Luther was changing the way people saw the world. And so he might have taken that a step further and we see the world differently now, but how do we think about the world? How, what's hiding there that we don't quite know about yet?
Yeah.
So I had the ideas circulating prior to the author's birth, and I found a couple of pictures. The first one is the We Can Do It picture with the women from the World War II, and later it was kind of used as a symbol for the feminist movement. And then I also found a picture or a painting done by Norman Rockwell, and it's called The Problems We All Live With, and it's depicting Ruby Bridges and how she was the first child to desegregate France Elementary School, and this took place in 1963. And I feel and like before he was born, a lot of the theme was just kind of like that minorities are like not seen as equal, or that they do not have as like good opportunities as others would. And I feel like some of the common ideas were kind of just like equality in general, and just that acceptance of like other races and people, and just like the cultures and opportunities that they have. And I think in the book that he shows that really well, because a lot of, from the first like section that we had, and just this last week, so I feel like a lot of the time he's talking about minorities and how like, because like our unconscious mind is thinks about them differently just because of the like experiences we've had with them. So
Kind of like drawing off of what you said, in mine I had like find like a similar work that was written before the author's lifetime. And there's this book called The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy, and he talks about how like the things that you put like into your, like when the subconscious accepts an idea, it proceeds to put it into effect immediately, but using all the like information you gather from like your environment and from your experiences. And Malcolm Gladwell kind of talks about that too. He says our first impressions are generated by our experiences and our environment, which means that we can change our first impressions. We can alter the way we thin slice by changing the experience that compromises those impressions. So like tied into like what you said, like our initial bias for maybe like why in like the IAT test where it's like 80% of people have a pro-white preference, that might be not because people are like trying to be racist, it's just because that's kind of like the environment that they're surrounded with, and that's partially because of like the different like historical events that you talked about. And so like he talked about how you can change like maybe your like initial like impressions or like biases. You have to change like your environment. Like thinking like consciously that you're not racist doesn't necessarily affect what your unconscious is thinking. That's kind of what I learned.
I
Yep.
think. Oh, sorry. I think most of what we read in this section was focused on like minorities and biases that like we don't even know we have, and like I think this influence, because he's half black, is what Lily said, and so he does talk about a lot of like black and white minorities, and I think it's probably because he has like experienced some of them. Like we're living in a world where, like Megan said, it said that most people like do have like a white bias even though they like don't even know it. And so him being half black, I think that like ties into like what he's trying, like our first instincts, like our first like judges of people might not be like correct because of what he's gone through in his life. So I think that kind of influenced him writing this section of the book.
I liked also like kind of going on with the idea, and like I liked that IAT test that I did, where like they had to separate like it into the two sections, where it had like black with like bad or something and white with good. And I just thought it was really interesting that like he was surprised that even though like he was like half black, he still like had like a negative association with like the like black race. And I just thought that was really interesting because it shows like how much power our unconscious mind actually has.
Well, it makes me think too, like maybe if in places where maybe like a black community is more prominent in like different countries, where that bias might be different, just because they're surrounded by different like by a different environment, right? Where like white necessarily isn't as heavily like as prominent. Like just to see if that would be interesting for me.
Yeah, one thing I actually wanted to ask is like how it'd be interesting to test the Warren Harding theory in like you said, just different environments, but also just to see how different people react to different things. Because that one guy that said he was watching the Olympics ended up having a less of a bias towards blacks. It makes me curious how, like when you test that, how much of an impact that would have on different kinds of people.
I actually found that page, and it says that then this one day he got a positive association with blacks, and he said that's odd, never gotten that before. And then later it goes into the fact that the reason why that happened is because he had been watching the Olympics, and that has a lot of like mixed race people doing all of the different sports, and so it was all in the environment that changed the way that he thought.
So we've been talking a lot about like white and black minorities, but I was wondering if there was any minorities that you guys could remember, like any other ones that he talked about in the book, examples.
I thought it was really interesting when he talked about the height bias.
Yeah.
How we talked about like how I think it was like 2/3, and I could be wrong, but like 2/3 of CEOs are like over 6 feet.
Yeah.
I thought that, and then the pay gap too.
Yeah, it was like
How-
$798
The pay gap
or
was
something,
crazy.
like
Yeah.
per inch tall you are, which
Mhm.
is crazy.
Yeah.
It was $789 worth in salary.
Was that per month or per year?
A
It's-
year.
Okay.
Yeah, and it says in here, which I also thought, like, nobody's gonna, like, I thought it was interesting that they said, like, nobody does it on purpose, and yet, like, it's such a big, like, thing, because no one's gonna be like, oh, like, sorry, Haley, you're, like, kind of short, so, like,
Yeah.
you can't have, like, a position of power almost. But, like, right here it says, no one ever says dismissively of a potential CEO candidate that he is too short. This is quite clearly the kind of unconscious biases that the IAT picks up on. So, like, in our brain, like, we think of power as someone being, like, big and, like, someone being, like, strong, and that's, like, a tall person. So that kind of just, like, I thought it was interesting that the IAT could, like, pick up on that.
Yeah, but going off of that, I actually looked at Martin Luther King's height, and he's 5'7". And I could have sworn that he was like 6 foot. And in like all
Yeah.
the pictures you see of him, because he looks like the same height, if not a little bit taller as all the people around him. And I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting.
They're people who are tall for the
Oh.
choose a winner or loser section. People who are tall are very much winners.
Yes.
Unconsciously. It's so
And just like with honestly with like the Warren like Hardner too, like people that are just naturally good looking or like have just based on how they look, they naturally just have an advantage over like people because in our mind we associate like certain things with like positions of power. And so when we see someone like that, it doesn't really matter. Like our brain kind of skips past that and just like it's like, well, they look like a president, so maybe
Yeah.
they should be the president.
and then
And then
become the president.
disaster.
Yeah, and then like there's also the fact of like someone could be like born like perceptively a loser, but they could like attempt to give off the appearance of a winner. Like there was one president we had that was in a wheelchair, but he'd like hold himself up at the podium because he wanted to appear like strong. And I just think that's interesting of how like it's like people would probably look down on him, and even like just subconsciously, just because he was in a wheelchair, but he like made that physical effort to like look like he was standing up.
I think that like in the section that we read, like the winner, kind of in general, is just like people that know how to like understand their unconscious mind. Like, for example, like in the book, what was his name? There was like Bob Golomb, something. But he was the car salesman, and it kind of just talks about how he was like so much more successful than like lots of the other ones, just because he knew like how his subconscious mind works and how it judged people, but he decided like not to listen to that. And just like in here, it kind of talks about how kind of like the minorities again, how car salesmen usually like make the price of the car higher if you're like a different race or if you're like a woman instead of a male. And I think it kind of just shows that like because he was able to like look past all of those, that he was able to be more successful.
Yeah, I definitely agree that he was a winner because he like looked at that.
I do think, yeah, like the main theme, like the winners of this section were like, he made it out to be like white males just because they like, because of like the experiment that he showed, like the study, like the initial offer for like a car salesman was $725, and then white women got an initial offer of $935, so that's like $200 more already. And then you get to black women, which are $1,195, and then black men are $1,687, and that's like such a big difference. And they think that they're being like fair and equal, but that's like how much is that, like $1,000 extra? I mean,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Well, and to me, it makes me think of like how it talks about how sometimes like your brain, it's like the unconscious thin slicing can actually be like harmful. So like one question I had was like, what like shows you that like thin slicing can actually be like disadvantageous? Because for me, I like looked at the car salesman, and I mean, like Bob had way more sales, and he was like well known because he was able to like see past his like unconscious thin slicing, right? He like says that he doesn't like he judges everyone on the same like spectrum.
And to go off that a little bit, I'm gonna move on to the structure for spontaneity, the ER part.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting how the doctors like attempting to thin slice failed so often because of the over information they got. And so like once they actually started to follow like that list of what to look for, they were actually a lot more accurate. I thought
That
really
was one of my
interesting.
questions. It was like, why did it work so much better when the doctors gave the diagnosis with less information? Because lots of people think like, oh, the more I have, like the easier it is to understand. But sometimes, like it says, what screws up doctors is that they take too much information into account. It serves only to overwhelm the physician still further. Doctors would do better in cases if they knew less about their patients. And it's not like they knew less of like they're like they still need to know like doctor knowledge, like I don't know, but like less of like their background, like oh he's old, because that could like screw up how they like give.
I found another quote from not the ER section, but when they were talking about the war games, where Paul Van Ripper says, you disintegrate everything and tear it apart, but you're never able to synthesize the whole. If you get too caught up in the production of information, you drown in data. So I thought it was super cool that they tied the war game to just the ER section, where they had too much information, and so they weren't able to figure out as well if people were having heart attacks.
One of the questions that I had was like, what problems show up when you like follow the less is more concept, and I was kind of thinking about that too, just like, or like with the doctors when they looked at like all of the information, they were like a lot less accurate. Like in the book it says that when doctors are left to their own devices, the patients were somewhere between 75% and 80% like they guessed right, but when they used the algorithm, they guessed more than 95% right. So I think it kind of just shows that like when sometimes more information isn't good, and like we need to trust our unconscious minds, because if we have too much information, it can kind of just like confuse us and distract us.
Yeah, well, it also, like it says also in the same ER section, it says, like, the problem arises when the additional information of, like, someone's gender and race is factored into a decision about an individual patient. It serves only to overwhelm the physician still further. And so doctors would be better in cases where they knew less about their patients, so they're not, like, because I think unconsciously they take into account, like, your gender and your race, or, like, your previous, like, things that aren't necessarily related to, like, your heart problem. And so that like affects their ability to just like trust their like intuition on like the diagnosis. If that makes sense.
Another one that I found that I thought was really interesting was like the one with like the jam at the supermarket.
Yeah.
And the question that I had with that was kind of just like, how could the idea less is more change our society or communities like for the better? And I think like overall it kind of just like in a way it would make us like more efficient or more like effective, just because like when they were talking about it, like when they had more choices, like they sold like a lot less products. And I just thought that was really interesting, because like I don't know, it just like shows that sometimes we can't like make decisions if we have too much information.
I don't know if you guys think there's any other like underlying themes, but I think one of them was like it also needs to be an equal balance. So because it says truly successful decision making relies on a balance between deliberate and instinctive thinking. So like yes, like too much information and like thinking too much can lead to like less accurate decisions, but like also some decisions like require some thinking. Like you probably should probably shouldn't just like pick out of a hat and say, well, I'm going to this college. Like you probably should like look at that a little bit more. So I think finding a balance is like important.
One of my questions was, why would Malcolm Gladwell focus so much on the war game? And I bring it up because my answer to that was like almost exactly what you said, because the quote was, when we talk about analytic versus intuitive decision making, neither is good or bad. What is bad is if you use either of them in an inappropriate circumstance. So I think it's important to know like the difference between when you should use like really rational, focused decision making versus like kind of blink decision making.
I think that kind of goes along with like the successful spontaneity part, because it's like he like didn't just put like his team out in battle and expected them to do something. Like they already knew like the rules, and like they like had already been prepared to make those like decisions. Like the knowledge was already there, and the unconscious was kind of just drawing from that.
Yeah, I had a quote from the same section as the war. And it says, I think we get in trouble when this process of editing is disrupted, when we can't edit or we don't know what to edit, or an environment that doesn't let us edit. And I just really like that because like it shows that sometimes like thin slicing works really well, but sometimes you need to like look at the like broader range of information to get like make the right decision.
One thing I thought that was interesting that we read was also with the improv. Like it is improv, like they do go up and they don't have like scripts or anything, but also it said they like practiced and they like practice going on. So that's kind of like what we were talking about, how like yes, it's like going out on a limb, but it's also like practicing how to do that. So it's like easier.
It's like they were prepared to make those snap judgments almost.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting because it really tied into last week when we learned about all of the professionals who could make snap judgments on that specific thing. So the people who were doing the improv, they practiced and became like professional in like all acting improv things, and then that made them able to do the snap judgments.
I just thought it was like amazing that there were still rules behind what I think is probably one of the most chaotic things ever. Just like that, for me, improv is random, like a monkey throwing a banana. But then the way he broke it down is like the monkey throws a banana at like 90%, like wow. His monkey's got his arm at like a 90% angle, 90-degree angle. And it just like broke it down in a way that it made you realize that there's so much more structure behind the chaos that I love that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to our
End.
podcast.
That was too quick.